On the morning of July 30th, 1943, at exactly 6:15 a.m., Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth squeezed himself into the tail gunner's compartment of the B-17, known as Tondelayo, stationed at RAF Kimballton. Through his window, he gazed at the gray English dawn, knowing it would soon transport him 500 miles deep into German territory. Arooth was just 24 years old and had already completed 12 combat missions with 3 confirmed enemy aircraft to his name. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had strategically positioned more than 300 fighters along the entire route leading to Kassel. Arooth lowered himself onto the bicycle-style seat that functioned as his workspace. His entire working area in the tail gunner position was a cramped space measuring just 4 feet in width and 5 feet in length. A pair of Browning M 2.50 caliber machine guns aimed rearward through a plexiglass bubble. When they reached their cruising altitude of 25,000 feet, the outside temperature would plummet to a brutal minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The only barrier standing between him and fatal hypothermia was his electrically heated flight suit. Within the 8th Air Force, this position was known as the most isolated job in the entire war. The tail gunner operated in complete solitude, cut off from his fellow crew members by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. There was nobody to converse with, nobody to assist him if things went sideways. Just one man, a pair of machine guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe decided to throw at him. The numbers painted a grim picture. During the summer months of 1943, the typical B-17 crew made it through only 11 missions on average before they were either shot down, killed in action, or taken as prisoners of war. Tail gunners had the shortest life expectancy of anyone aboard, except for those manning the ball turrets. German fighter pilots showed a clear preference for rear attacks. The tail position absorbed the initial wave of enemy fire. By July, the 379th Bombardment Group had already suffered the loss of 9 aircraft in merely 2 months of combat operations. 90 men were gone. The issue boiled down to simple geometry. German pilots had figured out that approaching from the rear gave them the maximum possible window of opportunity to fire. A Messerschmitt B-F 109, approaching at 350 miles per hour from directly behind, had approximately 10 seconds to line up his shot and fire before flying past the bomber. The tail gunner had those exact same 10 seconds to hit a target that was closing at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Most tail gunners never even got that chance. The Focke-Wulf 190 packed serious firepower, 2 20mm cannons, and 2 13mm machine guns. Just one concentrated burst could tear through the plexiglass bubble, kill the gunner instantly, and knock out the tail controls completely. Once a bomber lost its tail protection, it became an easy mark. The fighters would swing around, get back into position, and complete the job. The Standard Army Air Force's gunnery training instructed gunners to be patient, preserve their ammunition, and only engage targets when they closed within 300 yards. In a classroom setting, the theory seemed to make perfect sense. But in actual combat, waiting until 300 yards meant the enemy was already firing at you. By the time a tail gunner squeezed his triggers, he might already be a dead man. Arooth had witnessed this happen firsthand. During his 6th mission, a B-17 flying just off Tondelayo's right wing took a devastating direct hit to the tail section. That gunner never managed to fire even a single round. The fighter came in at high speed with all guns blazing, and the first rounds punched straight through the plexiglass before the American could even react. The bomber dropped out of formation, leaving a trail of smoke behind it. 8 parachutes blossomed in the sky. The tail gunner wasn't among them. The official doctrine insisted on patience and discipline. Arooth questioned absolutely everything about it. The German fighters attacked from extreme range precisely because they knew American gunners would hold their fire. Luftwaffe pilots had studied and memorized the patterns. They exploited the training manual as if it were a detailed roadmap showing them exactly what to expect. If you want to see how Arooth challenged the doctrine that was getting tail gunners killed, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Arooth. That morning, 186 B-17s lifted off from various bases scattered across eastern England. A force of 123 P-47 Thunderbolts would provide escort for part of the journey, but fuel limitations meant these fighters would have to turn back somewhere over Belgium. The bombers would complete the final 200 miles to Kassel without any fighter protection whatsoever. Arooth methodically checked his ammunition belts, 400 rounds for each gun, making 800 rounds total. The manual stated this was sufficient for a standard mission. Arooth had already concluded the manual was completely wrong about everything else. By noon, he would discover whether he was right. The price of being wrong was a flag-draped coffin and a telegram delivered to his family back home. The formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet, still steadily climbing. Through his plexiglass window, Arooth watched the water gradually recede below, the famous white cliffs of Dover shrinking to nothing more than a pale line on the distant horizon. Ahead of them lay occupied France, followed by Belgium, and then the very heart of Nazi Germany. The P-47 escorts maintained their protective positions around the bomber stream. Their presence provided a sense of security, but Arooth understood the cold mathematics. The Thunderbolts carried enough fuel for approximately 90 minutes of combat operations. The complete mission to Kassel would consume 6 hours. For the majority of the journey, the bombers would be flying completely alone. During his first several missions, Arooth had followed the doctrine to the letter. Wait for the fighter to get close, take careful aim, fire in controlled short bursts, conserve your ammunition carefully. The training instructors back at gunnery school had hammered these principles into every single student. Ammunition supplies were limited. Precision mattered far more than the volume of fire. A well-disciplined gunner could stretch 800 rounds across an entire mission. The doctrine operated on the assumption that the enemy would play along. The Luftwaffe absolutely did not. German pilots had thoroughly studied American tactics and procedures. They knew the gunners typically waited until targets reached 300 yards, so they simply opened fire at 600 yards, hammering the bomber formations with cannon shells while the Americans kept their fingers off their triggers. By the time the tail gunners finally started shooting back, the damage had already been inflicted. Arooth had worked out the problem from a completely different angle. A Focke-Wulf, 190 at 600 yards, wasn't actually a difficult target to hit. The aircraft was flying in a straight line directly toward him, with its nose pointed right at his position, presenting the largest possible silhouette. The rapid closure rate meant the fighter's apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who initiated fire early could walk his tracers right onto the target, making adjustments as the distance decreased. The gamble was ammunition expenditure. 800 rounds sounded like plenty until you divided it by the actual number of attacking fighters you'd face. A single mission might see 15, 20, or even 30 separate attack runs. At 50 rounds per engagement, the mathematics turned absolutely brutal. A gunner who fired early might find himself completely out of ammunition before the mission ended. Arooth was willing to accept that trade-off. A gunner who carefully conserved his ammunition but got killed during the third attack had made a terrible bargain. Survival required disrupting the enemy's attack run before it could succeed. If that strategy meant running dangerously low on bullets, he would deal with that problem when it arrived. Dead men have absolutely no use for reserve ammunition. His first real test arrived during his fourth mission, a bombing raid targeting submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire in June. A pair of Bf-109s maneuvered into position from the 6 o'clock low approach. This was the textbook tail attack. Standard doctrine clearly said to wait. Arooth opened fire at 700 yards instead. The tracers arced across the sky, initially falling short, then gradually climbing toward the lead fighter. The German pilot spotted the incoming fire and immediately broke off his attack, diving away before he could reach effective cannon range. His wingman followed suit. Neither fighter managed to score a single hit on Tondelayo. After landing, the crew chief had some questions for Arooth. The ammunition count revealed he had burned through nearly 200 rounds during a single engagement. At that rate of fire, he would completely run out of ammo before reaching targets deep inside Germany. Arooth laid out his reasoning and logic. The crew chief remained unconvinced. Word about the incident spread among the other tail gunners. Some labeled it reckless behavior. Wasting precious ammunition on long-range shots violated everything the Army Air Forces had taught them. The training manuals existed for good reasons. Arooth was gambling with his entire crew's lives. But Tondelayo kept returning home safely. Mission after mission, the bomber made it back to Kimballton with every crew member intact. Other aircraft in the 527th Squadron weren't nearly so fortunate. By mid-July, 3 bombers from the squadron had been shot down. 30 men were lost. Now, as they crossed into Belgium on July 30th, Arooth watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings in farewell and turn back toward England. The fuel gauges in the Thunderbolts demanded their retreat. The bombers continued pressing forward alone. Somewhere up ahead, 300 German fighters sat waiting. Arooth would need every single round he had loaded. He would also need to survive long enough to actually use them. The first Messerschmitts appeared at 11:42, climbing up from the southeast in tight groups of 4 aircraft. Arooth counted 8, then 12, then simply stopped counting. The sky behind Tondelayo filled with black crosses painted on yellow noses. The lead fighter initiated its attack run from the 6 o'clock high position, diving toward the bomber formation at 400 miles per hour. Arooth tracked the aircraft through his gun sight, watching the wingspan grow steadily larger with each passing second. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers simultaneously. The twin Brownings roared to life, sending a bright stream of tracers streaking across the sky. The first rounds fell short, vanishing into empty air below the diving fighter. Arooth made adjustments, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, the tracers began making contact. Bright flashes sparked and danced along the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. The German pilot broke hard to the right, with smoke now trailing from his aircraft. He never managed to complete his firing pass. The fighter spiraled downward, disappearing into the cloud layer below. Arooth had no time to watch its fate. The second attacker was already closing in fast. This one approached lower, attempting to slip beneath Arooth's effective field of fire. The angle made things difficult, requiring him to depress his guns nearly to their mechanical limit. He fired anyway, sending a long burst streaming toward the approaching fighter. The Focke-Wulf pilot flinched at the sight, pulling up prematurely and releasing his cannon shells harmlessly into empty sky above Tondelayo. The attacks kept coming for 47 continuous minutes. Wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the bomber formation, specifically targeting stragglers and any damaged aircraft they could identify. Arooth fired at absolutely everything that came within range, burning through ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels began glowing red from the sustained firing. At 12:29, a Bf-109 approached from directly astern, flying straight and level without maneuvering. The pilot possessed either extraordinary courage or seriously poor judgment. Arooth centered the fighter perfectly in his gun sight and held both triggers down hard. The Brownings hammered away for 6 continuous seconds, pouring over 100 rounds into the approaching aircraft. The Messerschmitt simply disintegrated, the engine separated from the fuselage. The wings folded backward unnaturally. What remained of the fighter tumbled past Tondelayo, close enough for Arooth to clearly see the empty cockpit. The pilot had either successfully ejected or died at the controls. 2 confirmed kills. Ammunition depleted down to 180 rounds. The formation reached Kassel at 12:51 and initiated its bombing run. For 11 agonizing minutes, the bombers flew straight and level, completely unable to maneuver, while the bombardiers carefully lined up their targets. The Luftwaffe understood this moment represented maximum vulnerability. The fighters pressed their attacks with renewed fury and aggression. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from the 5 o'clock position. Arooth swung his guns to intercept it, firing a short, controlled burst. The rounds struck the fighter's wing root directly. The pilot kept coming anyway, his cannon shells tearing through Tondelayo's tail section. Arooth felt the impacts before he registered the pain. 20-millimeter fragments ripped through the plexiglass, shredding his flight suit and burying themselves deep in his left arm and shoulder. His left gun jammed completely. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the entire compartment. He kept firing with just the right gun. One-handed and bleeding heavily, he continued tracking the wounded Focke-Wulf as it pulled away. A final burst caught the fighter's tail assembly squarely. The aircraft snap-rolled violently and dove toward the ground far below. His 3rd kill of the mission. The intercom crackled with urgent voices from the crew. Someone was asking about damage assessment. Someone else reported flak batteries ahead. Arooth tried to respond, but his throat had gone completely dry. Blood pooled on the floor of his compartment, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero air. 400 rounds expended, only 63 remaining. 3 German fighters destroyed, and the mission was barely half over. Tondelayo still had to fly 250 miles back to England, fighting through the exact same gauntlet of fighters that had nearly killed him on the way in. Arooth wrapped a scarf tightly around his wounded arm and waited for the next attack to begin. The return flight commenced at 13:04. Tondelayo turned westward, along with 185 other bombers, leaving Kassel burning beneath a massive column of black smoke. Arooth remained at his position, scanning the sky through the blood-smeared plexiglass. The Luftwaffe wasn't finished yet. German fighters regrouped over Belgium, repositioning themselves along the bomber stream's route back to the English Channel. Fresh aircraft replaced those that had been lost or damaged during the morning attacks. The second gauntlet would prove just as dangerous as the first. Arooth's left arm had gone completely numb from both the cold and his wounds. His jammed gun remained completely inoperable, the feed mechanism shattered by the same cannon shell that had injured him. He had one functioning weapon and exactly 63 rounds of ammunition to cover 250 miles of hostile airspace. The mathematics demanded a completely different approach. With only 63 rounds available, he could afford perhaps 3 engagements of roughly 20 rounds each. Every single trigger pull had to count now. The luxury of suppressive fire had completely vanished. At 13:31, a pair of Bf-109s closed in from the 7 o'clock position. Arooth waited patiently until they reached 500 yards, then fired a precise 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck the engine cowling directly. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing glycol coolant in a white stream. The wingman broke off without attacking. 51 rounds remaining. Tondelayo crossed back into France at 14:15. The fighter attacks gradually diminished as the Luftwaffe reached the outer limit of their operational range. By 14:47, the bomber formation had finally outrun the last German interceptors. The English Channel appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. The landing at Kimballton came at 15:52. Arooth couldn't climb out of his compartment without assistance from the ground crew. They pulled him through the narrow hatch and carried him directly to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon counted 11 separate fragment wounds scattered across his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Word spread rapidly through the 379th Bombardment Group. Within just a few hours, everyone knew that the tail gunner on Tondelayo had scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables while wounded, operating a single gun with only 63 rounds of ammunition remaining. The mission intelligence report specifically noted his early engagement technique as a significant contributing factor to the bomber's survival. Other tail gunners began asking serious questions. The standard doctrine clearly said to wait until 300 yards. Arooth had opened fire at 800. The doctrine emphasized conserving ammunition carefully. Arooth had burned through 700 rounds before getting hit. The doctrine was producing dead gunners. Arooth was still alive. The 527th Squadron's gunnery officer carefully reviewed the combat footage from Tondelayo's mission. The gun camera footage clearly showed Arooth's tracers reaching out far beyond normal engagement range, successfully disrupting attack runs before the German pilots could establish stable firing solutions. The early fire forced the enemy to maneuver defensively, degrading their accuracy and significantly reducing the number of hits on the bomber. By mid-August, 3 other tail gunners in the squadron had adopted variations of Arooth's aggressive technique. Their survival rates improved noticeably. The bombers they protected returned to base with considerably less damage. The correlation was becoming difficult to ignore. The 379th Group commander received a preliminary report on September 1st. The data strongly suggested that aggressive early fire significantly reduced bomber casualties by disrupting coordinated fighter attacks. The implications directly challenged 2 full years of established gunnery doctrine. Meanwhile, Arooth recovered from his wounds at the station hospital. The fragment damage had fortunately missed all major blood vessels and nerves. The flight surgeon cleared him for active duty on August 19th, just 3 weeks after the Kassel mission. Tondelayo had a brand new aircraft waiting for him. The old bomber had been officially written off after accumulating too much battle damage for economical repair. The replacement aircraft carried the same name and the same experienced crew. Arooth climbed back into the tail position on August 26th. The Luftwaffe had noticed something changing in the American bomber formations. Their intelligence officers were actively studying the problem. Luftwaffe intelligence officers identified the pattern in early September. American tail gunners were initiating fire much earlier, sometimes at ranges exceeding 600 yards. This change significantly disrupted attack formations that had worked reliably for many months. German fighter pilots reported this tactical shift during debriefings across occupied Europe. The approach from 6 o'clock, once considered the safest angle for attacking B-17 formations, was becoming increasingly dangerous and costly. Tracers reached out before pilots could establish stable firing platforms. The psychological effect proved significant. Any pilot watching tracers stream toward his aircraft at long range instinctively maneuvered, even when the rounds were actually falling short. The Luftwaffe's tactical response developed in 3 distinct phases. First, they dramatically increased approach speeds, diving on bomber formations at maximum velocity to reduce their exposure time. Second, they shifted their attack angles, approaching from the high 6 o'clock position where gravity would assist their pull-out maneuver. Third, they began specifically targeting aircraft that appeared to have particularly aggressive gunners, hoping to eliminate the threat before it could spread further. None of these adaptations solved the fundamental underlying problem. Faster approaches inevitably meant less accurate shooting. Steeper attack angles increased the difficulty of tracking targets smoothly through the dive. Targeting aggressive gunners required identifying them in advance, which proved nearly impossible in the absolute chaos of a running air battle. The 379th Bombardment Group flew 11 missions between August 26th and September 5th. Arooth participated in 4 of them, adding 2 more confirmed kills to his growing record. Other tail gunners in the group claimed an additional 7 victories. The Luftwaffe's loss ratio against the Triangle K bombers was climbing steadily. German fighter commanders attempted concentrating their attacks more effectively. Instead of spreading interceptors across the entire bomber stream, they massed their forces against single groups, hoping to overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers alone. The tactic produced devastating results on September 3rd when concentrated attacks against the 100th Bombardment Group destroyed 8 aircraft in just 15 minutes. The 379th escaped that particular slaughter by flying in a different position within the combat box formation. But the lesson came through crystal clear. The Luftwaffe was actively adapting, constantly searching for weaknesses in the new defensive approach. The air war over Europe had evolved into a contest of tactical innovation, with each side carefully studying the other's methods and developing effective countermeasures. Arooth fully understood the stakes. His technique worked primarily because it surprised the enemy. Once the Germans developed truly effective responses, the tactical advantage would disappear completely. Every mission served as a test. Every engagement provided a data point that both sides would analyze thoroughly. The temporary edge that aggressive fire provided was steadily eroding with each passing week. The mission scheduled for September 6th would target Stuttgart, located deep in southern Germany. The route would carry the bombers over 500 miles of enemy territory, making it the longest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that entire month. Intelligence predicted extremely heavy fighter opposition from bases scattered across France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Stuttgart manufactured ball bearings, components that were absolutely essential to every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon system in the German arsenal. The strategic importance made it one of the most heavily defended targets in all of Europe. Flak batteries ringed the entire city. Fighter squadrons were strategically positioned along every likely approach route. The briefing on September 5th laid out the immense challenge clearly. The 379th would fly in the lead position of the entire combat wing, assuming responsibility for navigation and bomb aiming for all the formations following behind. Lead position meant absorbing the very first fighter attacks. It meant flying straight and level, while other groups could maneuver defensively. It meant maximum exposure to absolutely everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Arooth checked his guns thoroughly that evening. Both Brownings had been freshly serviced. The feed mechanism operated smoothly, and the barrels had been replaced after accumulating too many fired rounds. He loaded 1,200 rounds instead of the standard 800. The extra ammunition added considerable weight, but weight seemed far less important than available firepower. Tomorrow would test absolutely everything he had learned through bitter experience. Tomorrow would determine whether his methods could survive the most dangerous mission of his entire career. The Stuttgart mission launched at 5:40 on September 6th. A total of 187 bombers climbed into an overcast English sky, forming up over the North Sea before turning southeast toward occupied Europe. Tondelayo flew in the lead element of the 379th Formation, positioned exactly where Arooth would face the first attacks from any direction. The fighters found them over France at 9:15. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose from airfields across the entire region, climbing rapidly to intercept the bomber stream before it could reach German airspace. The initial attacks came from the 11 o'clock position, head-on passes that tested the nose gunners rather than the tail position. Arooth waited patiently, watching contrails multiply steadily behind the formation. The Luftwaffe was building strength, assembling fighters from multiple units into one concentrated force. By 9:40, intelligence estimates counted over 100 interceptors actively tracking the bombers. The rear attacks began at 10:08. A staffel of 12 Bf-109s positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the formation, then pulled up sharply in a climbing attack from the 6 o'clock low position. Arooth opened fire at 700 yards, sending tracers streaming into the lead element. 2 fighters broke off immediately. A third absorbed multiple direct hits and fell away smoking heavily. The remaining 9 pressed their attack with determination. Cannon shells ripped through the formation, striking bombers throughout the entire 379th Combat Box. The B-17 flying off Tondelayo's left wing took damaging hits to its No. 3 engine. Another bomber in the low squadron began trailing fuel from ruptured wing tanks. Arooth kept firing continuously, shifting rapidly from target to target as fighters flashed through his field of view. His ammunition counter dropped steadily. 600 rounds, 500, 400. The attacks showed absolutely no sign of diminishing. At 10:31, a Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from directly above and behind, cleverly using the sun to mask its approach. Arooth spotted the fighter far too late. 20-millimeter shells punched through the tail section before he could bring his guns to bear properly. The violent impacts threw him hard against the plexiglass. His left gun was completely destroyed, the receiver shattered by a direct hit. Metal fragments tore through his flight suit, opening fresh wounds across his arms and scalp. Blood poured down his face, partially blinding him. He kept firing with just the right gun. The Focke-Wulf pulled up sharply and rolled away, trailing smoke from hits he'd scored during its dive. Arooth wiped blood from his eyes and immediately searched for the next attacker coming in. Tondelayo was dying around him. The fighter's cannon fire had severed critical hydraulic lines, damaged the tail control surfaces, and punctured fuel tanks in the wing roots. The pilots fought desperately to maintain altitude, but the bomber was steadily losing its battle against gravity and aerodynamics. The formation reached Stuttgart at 11:04. Tondelayo held its position just long enough to release its bombs over the target area, then fell out of formation as the accumulating damage overwhelmed the crew's ability to compensate. 2 engines were running extremely rough. The fuel situation had become critical. The pilots made their decision over eastern France. Tondelayo simply could not reach England. The best remaining option was a controlled ditching in the English Channel, where air-sea rescue units might reach them before hypothermia claimed their lives. Arooth remained steadfastly at his position as the bomber descended gradually, watching vigilantly for any fighters that might pursue the crippled aircraft. None came. The Luftwaffe had other targets to focus on, healthier bombers still flying in tight formation. Tondelayo hit the channel at 15:12, impacting the gray water at 120 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart violently on impact. Arooth was thrown forward hard, his head striking the gun mount with tremendous force. Then darkness consumed everything. When he regained consciousness, he found himself floating in a life raft. British rescue boats were approaching rapidly. All 10 crew members had miraculously survived the ditching. The bomber that had carried them through 17 dangerous missions now lay at the bottom of the English Channel. The 379th Commander was already requesting Arooth's detailed mission reports. The Distinguished Service Cross citation arrived on October 14, 1943. This second highest military decoration the United States Army could award specifically recognized Arooth's actions during both the Kassel and Stuttgart missions. The citation specifically mentioned his decision to continue firing while seriously wounded, crediting his defensive fire with protecting the bomber during its most vulnerable moments. The 8th Air Force's gunnery staff had completed their comprehensive analysis by late October. The data covered 14 bomber groups across 3 full months of combat operations. The conclusions fundamentally challenged assumptions that had governed American air combat doctrine since 1942. Tail gunners who engaged targets beyond 500 yards demonstrated measurably higher survival rates compared to those who followed standard doctrine precisely. The early fire successfully disrupted enemy formations, forcing German pilots to maneuver defensively rather than establishing stable firing platforms. The ammunition cost was undeniably significant, but the trade-off clearly favored the aggressive approach. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command's operational planning, personally reviewed the findings. The implications extended far beyond individual aircraft performance. If coordinated, early fire from multiple bombers could successfully disrupt mass fighter attacks. The entire defensive doctrine might require complete revision. The formal policy change came in November. New gunnery guidelines officially authorized tail gunners to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. The bureaucratic language remained cautious, but the underlying meaning was crystal clear. The approach that had kept Arooth alive was becoming official doctrine throughout the command. Arooth never witnessed the policy take full effect across the force. His head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching proved more serious than initial medical assessments had indicated. After returning to flight status in late September, he completed 3 additional missions before medical officers grounded him permanently. Recurring severe headaches and vision problems made continued combat duty completely impossible. His final tally stood at 17 confirmed kills, with 4 additional probables still awaiting verification. This number placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the entire 8th Air Force. Some historical records credited him with as many as 19 victories, though documentation inconsistencies made precise counts difficult to establish definitively. The Distinguished Flying Cross followed the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his cumulative combat achievements. The Purple Heart acknowledged his wounds sustained in action. By the time his combat career officially ended, Arooth had accumulated more decorations than most pilots ever received. The 379th Bombardment Group continued operations for another 18 months, flying through the brutal winter of 1943, the invasion summer of 1944, and the final campaigns of 1945. The tactics Arooth had pioneered spread throughout 8th Bomber Command. Tail gunners across the entire 8th Air Force adopted various variations of the early engagement doctrine. The statistical impact emerged gradually over time. Bomber loss rates declined steadily through 1944, though multiple factors contributed to this improvement. Longer-range fighter escorts significantly reduced exposure to unprotected combat. Improved aircraft systems enhanced overall survivability, but defensive gunnery also played a crucial role, and the shift toward aggressive fire was definitely part of that improvement. German fighter pilots noticed the change clearly. Interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe aircrew specifically mentioned the increased danger of tail attacks against American formations. The easy kills that had characterized early bomber interceptions became progressively harder to achieve. Some pilots shifted entirely to head-on attacks, accepting the higher closure rates in exchange for avoiding the concentrated rear hemisphere fire. Arooth shipped home to the United States in early 1944. The Army Air Forces assigned him to training duties, allowing him to pass his hard-won combat experience to new gunners preparing for deployment overseas. He spent the remainder of the war teaching others the precise techniques that had kept him alive through 17 missions. The students who passed through his courses carried his methods into combat over Germany, over Japan, over every theater where American bombers faced enemy fighters. What he did after the war surprised everyone who knew him well. Michael Arooth did not leave military service when the war ended. He transferred to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947 and continued serving for another 15 years. The man who had survived the deadliest skies over Europe deliberately chose to remain in uniform until 1962, retiring at the rank of Master Sergeant. The decision puzzled some people who knew his history well. Arooth had accumulated enough combat experience for several lifetimes. He had been wounded twice in action, ditched in the English Channel, and faced death more times than official records could possibly capture. Most veterans with similar experiences wanted nothing more than to return to civilian life. Arooth saw it completely differently. The Air Force had given him genuine purpose during the darkest years of the century. The skills he developed had saved lives, not just his own, but the crews who flew with him and the gunners who learned from his methods. Walking away felt like abandoning something truly important. His post-war years were quiet and peaceful. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences with anyone. The medals stayed locked in a drawer. The memories stayed locked away deep inside. Like so many veterans of his generation, Arooth believed that those who had not been there could never truly understand what they'd experienced. Elmer Bendener, Tondelayo's navigator, took a very different path after the war. He became a journalist and author, eventually writing a memoir titled _0_. The book described the crew's experiences in vivid detail, preserving moments that might otherwise have been lost to history forever. Bendener's account ensured that Tondelayo and her crew would never be forgotten. The 379th Bombardment Group held reunions for decades after the war ended. Veterans gathered regularly to remember friends who had not returned home, to share stories that their families had never heard, to honor the young men they had once been. Arooth attended whenever his health permitted, reconnecting with survivors from those desperate months over Europe. The National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona received his remains on February 20th, 1990. He had died 5 days earlier in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 70. The headstone listed his rank, his service branch, and his war. It did not mention the 17 fighters he had destroyed, or the crews he had protected, or the doctrine he had helped reshape completely. Military cemeteries are filled with such understatements. The stones mark names and dates, but they cannot possibly capture the weight of what those names truly represent. Arooth lies among thousands of other veterans, each one with stories that deserve telling. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England. The 379th Bombardment Group's records are carefully archived there, including mission reports that document Arooth's combat achievements. Researchers can trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through documents that bear his direct influence. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists in modern warfare. The aircraft that carried men like Arooth into combat have mostly vanished, reduced to museum pieces and memorial displays. But the principles he demonstrated, the value of aggressive action over passive defense, the willingness to challenge doctrine that was getting men killed, those principles endure to this day. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about tail gunners who protected their crews with courage and innovation. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer here. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Michael Arooth does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.